Welcome to the True Story London podcast. I'm Michelle Toth. In this podcast, we listen to a true personal story told live at one of our shows in London, followed by a conversation with the storyteller about their background, process, story themes, and more. Today's storyteller is Tihane, sharing her story of how a bizarre neurological experience unlocked some unsettling, once-buried memories. As an artist and a musician, Tihane has a distinctive creative style that really shines through in this intimate yet bold telling of her story. Afterward, I'll talk with Tihane more about the context of her story, the nature of unexplained and mystical phenomena, and the experience of living beyond trauma. But first, let's listen to her story recorded live at 21 Soho.
I was 22 years old, notoriously bold, cynical, and insecure, sitting on a beach about to take some psychedelics with friends, ready for a fun Sunday, when I quickly realized this wasn't going to be one of them. Instead, I wound up wrapped around the toilet bowl with a ferocious nausea and started realizing that the stripes on the bathroom wallpaper, which were definitely vertical when I entered, were now horizontal. And as these two-tone stripes merged into one endless plane extending in all directions, I heard this pulsing sound, whoom, 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 filling the entirety of my consciousness. And I noticed I could see my body on the bathroom floor. My perspective kept rising, and I could see where my friends were in each room of the house, and further to see the city of Los Angeles and the California coastline as I was pulled upward like a cat grabbed by the back of its neck. I felt this enormous vacuum of piercing light sucking me into some unseen threshold beyond me, and at the very last possible moment I somehow knew I couldn't come back from, I heard a voice in my head say calmly and firmly 2 words, "Not yet." And in that instant, I inhaled like it was the first breath of my life and stood up from the bathroom floor back in my body, grabbing for the door handle, which was opened at the same time by my childhood best friend, looking at me and saying, "Oh my God, you've been gone forever. Are you okay?" And I suddenly realized I had no idea who she was, nor who I was, nor any language, thoughts, concepts, or anything at all. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, as a psychedelic experience unfolds, it's quite average for people to appear like miscellaneous toddlers wandering about. So no one noticed my complete amnesia for the next 5 hours. And by some miracle, I eventually felt this jolt of recollection hit me, like jamming a USB drive into an empty computer and filling it with a lifetime of memories, thoughts, and information as my entire identity was rebooted in the blink of an eye. And I was relieved, of course. But I was also different, weird different, eerie different, because there was this lingering feeling that something else had been slipped into that data download that wasn't in my system before. I had no idea what it was or where it was, but I felt it like a phantom limb. In the months that followed, trying to make sense of this bizarre experience in the bathroom, I met a parade of neurologists, psychologists, autoimmune specialists. I had CT scans and blood panels done and redone, and finally figured out that the year before I'd been chronically exposed to the worst variety of toxic mold while living in upstate New York. Sitting through 5 months of winter in my ex-boyfriend's basement apartment, chain-smoking cigarettes in front of his fireplace, I'd been inhaling the mold spores from the wet ceilings that neither of us knew were grafting to our lungs, ears, nose, and throat. The doctors all confirmed that with a severe toxic mold infection, it's highly advisable to avoid eating any variety of mushroom. Portobello, button, shiitake, oyster, let alone magic mushrooms. So when the fungus of the toxic mold ravaging my system was finally overloaded by the fungus of the magic mushrooms, I neurologically short-circuited. So was it a real near-death experience? Was it not? It actually didn't matter. What mattered was that sense of foreboding strangeness that I'd had since the day I was rebooted continued to unfold into what I called the dreams. These were vivid dreams containing detailed information I could not explain, like seeing a sequence of photographs from a time in my childhood I'd never been able to remember, and waking up in my bed saying, July 5th, 1995, out loud. As a skeptical person, as a non-religious person, as a cynical person, it was all starting to feel too ridiculous. So I decided to invite my mother to the beach one day to ask her questions about certain characters that were appearing in these recurring dreams. As I described the strange face and clothes of one man in particular, she looked at me sheepishly and then down at the sand, looking much like an ashamed little girl herself, and said, "Oh, I always thought it was something like this." And we just sat there like that, like two kids in a sandbox waiting for our mothers to pick us up. During that time, I did several things just to stay alive. I had weekly doctor's appointments to rebuild the circuits in my brain-body connection. I wrote a lot of angry poetry, and I wandered around Los Angeles in and out of random shops when I didn't want to be around anyone, but also didn't want to be alone. In one of these shops, a girl who embodied the classic LA yoga pants wearing, green juice drinking, sage blowing stereotype told me about this totally amazing shaman woman who was supposedly powerful enough to heal people with diseases. Now, I mentioned I was a skeptic, but I was a hater. I had always hated this kind of woo-woo California bullshit with a passion. But that was before I died, before the dreams and this weird abyss of memories I was desperately trying to make sense of. So when this totally amazing shaman woman called me and started telling me things about my family that no one but me could have known, and described in great detail the symptoms I was experiencing and the depths of the dark space I was in, I became curious. And when she offered to help me without any cost, if I could just go to Las Vegas, I did, immediately. It wasn't because I wanted to. I just had to. The pain in my body had become unbearable, even as the test results with the doctors were slowly improving, and the mental pain was even worse. So I headed out for the 5-hour drive across the desert in my scrappy little car towards this total stranger, praying to a God I didn't believe in to protect me. I arrived in a bizarrely normal suburban neighborhood of cookie-cutter duplexes, none of the haunted castles or hippie communes I was expecting, and I knocked on the door. Now, I didn't know what a shaman looked like, but it didn't look like Valerie. She looked more like a clerk at a health food store. Except one thing. She had these impossibly clear blue eyes that seemed to look all the way through me and made me feel as though I'd never been seen before in my life. The closest I'd ever been to any kind of mystic was this sexy yoga teacher I'd had a crush on once, and Valerie must have known it because she said I could just suspend my need to understand anything that was happening here and treat the whole thing like it was theater, dress up, make-believe. And I did. She began by saying that science at the cellular level shows us how we can eliminate illness from the body. There were many foreign languages spoken and incense blown and musical sounds played at different parts of my body. I laid on a table, feeling my body vibrate so hard that I realized why all those corny antique paintings of exorcisms and magic shows show people floating off the table, not because they're actually floating effortlessly, but because their body is shaking so violently that there's distance between their back and the surface beneath them. There were things in my mind I saw that, again, no one but me could have seen, yet Valerie described them in detail. And then I felt like she pulled something out of my body that had been weighing me down my entire life. When we were done, we sat on her couch eating popcorn and watching a cartoon about cosmic kids in a foreign universe. And she looked over at me with her X-ray eyes and all those years of otherworldly wisdom and said, "Rape sucks. Don't be so hard on yourself. It takes time." Driving back the next morning in the middle of nowhere, I saw this old amusement park with a rickety wooden roller coaster. And for some reason, I stopped, bought a ticket, and climbed into the front of this rattling thing. As we flew into motion, I remembered Valerie telling me that our souls all choose to come to this place, to feel pain and pleasure, to grow, to live. The wind was so intense, I kept pressing the back of my neck up to the seat to hold myself against the pressure. When I heard that voice in my head gently lean me forward into the momentum of the ride, releasing the tension in my body and letting go of my resistance. And this time I heard that voice in my head say another 2 words that again changed the course of my life. Lean in. Thank you.
Tihane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. This is really exciting.
It is so lovely to see you here. Your story was extraordinary. It really had such an impact in the room. How did you feel telling it?
It was an amazing experience, and it made me realize that even though I've been in plays and I perform music all the time, and that includes storytelling, and I've done talks, I've never just stood in a room full of a bunch of people I don't know and just told a really intimate story. So it was actually a really new experience for me, even though I've done similar things for so long in my life.
Yes, the kind of true personal storytelling that we're doing is very different than performing even something that's meaningful and real. And we've seen that over and over again. The first time you told this story to anyone, I think you told me it took about 45 minutes.
At least.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then you had to pick and choose your moments. And you did such a good job. Like your willingness to edit in the end. Like at times you took things, I was like, where'd it go? And you were like, oh.
I know. Then there were moments where I was very stubborn as well, where you'd be like, how do you feel about this? And I would say like, I want that adjective, that extra third adjective that we don't need is mine. But then in the end, I might take it out anyway.
I know. Well, that is such an interesting part of the process, helping people to refine and edit their story, is just making sure you don't edit out them, their style, the way they want to express themselves. And you have such a distinctive style. Your use of language is really part of who you are. So it's kind of important not to take that away by any stretch. And I don't think we did. I think
not at all.
Yeah,
no, I felt very, very allowed to keep all my strange little quirks and fixations, but also to stretch into a new space.
So can we talk a bit about your story?
Yes.
Is there anything about the backstory that's particularly important to you that you think people would be interested in knowing about?
I think that some things that would actually lend to expanding this story in particular, if you listen to it. As a young girl, a very young girl, I would wake up from these mysterious dreams that a lot of doctors call night terrors, where you are sort of like in between this dream and this waking experience. So in night terrors, you'll have physical symptoms. So I would wake up like my legs were on fire. I'm very convinced that that was happening. And as my mom would try to soothe me or calm me down, I would start telling her about like being in this village and that my village was burned and that my mother was killed. And she would try, in trying to presence me back to reality, she would say, okay, well, I'm your mother. And I would just in a very, very clear-minded way say to her, I'm not talking about you. I know you're my mother. I'm talking about my other mother, like in this other world, in this other life. That was from about the age of 3. And that is also where
oh my goodness,
some of the things in my life started happening that were more complicated and darker. But even before that, as a very small infant, there was a joke in my family like, oh, she's talking to the angels again, because I would just look out the window and be blabbering and baby talk, but in this very deep, long format conversation with something or someone that nobody else could see.
Amazing.
Yeah. So it's interesting. And there wasn't space really in the story to say that when I had this mysterious, I think I called it like a weird abyss of memories and sort of supernatural experiences I was trying to make sense of, it wasn't just that it was happening for the first time in my life. It also then helped me to remember and reconnect with this sensation and experience that had been there in the beginning, but sort of blacked out along the way because there wasn't necessarily a place for it, or it just didn't make sense in my life.
Wow. As you're describing this to me, it's so reminiscent of fascinating conversations I've had. And your whole Valerie experience was so reminiscent for me of various experiences I've had, which is probably a tiny bit personal from a podcast perspective.
I think
but
people
it's
can relate to that, though. I think a lot of people, and again, we all have different ways of sort of making sense of that. And I think that that is the part of the story, whether someone has had, capital T trauma, like big trauma that they've ever gone through, or even had any sort of mystical experience. A lot of people haven't per se. I think that anyone can relate and respond to that feeling of, waking up from a dream that just feels so uncanny, or having a set of coincidences happen that can't just be coincidences. Yes. And we all wonder about that.
Absolutely. And so with my left brain friends, like super logic driven friends, when I try to explain my own beliefs or my own instincts about how all this energy stuff works, I say it as it's science we don't understand yet. And when I'm talking to my more spiritual or believing friends, I think it's just a little bit easier to have the conversation and compare notes about different coincidences.
I like that you talked about science, because I'm actually a science geek. I love science. And a huge part of that is actually because all of the mysticism that really came into my life during this period that I talk about in the story was also concurrent with learning about neurology. And the more that you learn about neuroscience and the way that we know and don't know how we are, you realize how mystical the scientific experience of being alive is. And there are so many documentaries and books and texts where these prolific scientists that we revere will also sort of trail off at a certain point and then say, yeah, and we just can't really explain that. Consciousness. Still, there's no real math to explain what is consciousness. It's still this huge debate. And I think that is the beautiful thing that I've been gifted with in this experience, was that I was given the mystical aspects, the human emotional aspects, and the scientific aspects all at the same time. And so I really feel like it was life's way of making sure that the skeptic in me was hit from every angle. There was no way that I could justify it away. It's every single parallel kind of reality, if it was the more materialistic or the more mystical, was all pointing to the same undefinable truth.
Sure. And it also integrative, to have that all happening at once. Yes. Yeah, I think the science is utterly fascinating, and how our brains work. We're still figuring out so much. So hopefully this will all make sense to next generation. Exactly. But for us right now, there's still a bit of a mystery. At least for me, it requires some suspension of disbelief in order to just keep one's mind open and see what happens.
Yes. And that's exactly why I wrote that line in there about how Valerie tells me as well to just suspend the need to understand, because she knew in that moment that if I was trying to understand it through my conscious mind, that I would miss it or I would block it. That's what's so beautiful about storytelling as well, right? Then that's why I love storytelling. I identify as a storyteller beyond any of the other things that I do in my life, because I think it's just real life magic. There is just so much magic in telling a story that might not even have a conclusive end or even a big intention, but there's just something cathartic and expansive and healing about having that experience. And I think that is the same form of those energetic medicinal experiences that we have. It's not needing to understand it, but knowing that you've been healed by it.
And did you have any reactions after telling the story when people were commenting on your story? Was it a mix of people who could relate to what you were describing in terms of the healing and the energy work? Or was it people who were unfamiliar with that kind of phenomenon?
I think it was definitely a mix, because there were some that felt as though they were speaking from deep wells of personal experience in very similar textures and maybe even parallel storylines in their life. And then I felt still that for others who might not have their own personal lived experience that felt relatable to it, they connected and they would speak to that in some kind of way. It wasn't just, oh, I'm sure that must be really hard for you. Thanks for sharing that story. Maybe because the story isn't just about a moment of sexual trauma, right? And I think that it could just be a story about that. There could be books and books about just that. It doesn't need to be about any more than that. But because for me, it wasn't just a story about that. It was a story about so many other things and consciousness and life and grappling with so many inexplicable experiences. I think many people who had different life experiences still had personal connections to the story.
I agree with you completely. The universality of stories as language, as mechanism of connection and communicating is so apparent. A person does not need to have experienced the same thing to be able to deeply relate to it. So I can feel empathy for what you went through and really feel connected in that way. I can also feel less isolation given my own experience and my own traumas and difficulties, because you're giving voice to yours and it makes me feel less alone. That's the gift of you sharing your story, is not merely broadcasting it. It's like an invitation to connection, and you might not even ever speak to the person.
Yes.
Which is just amazing.
It is. And it's really a powerful experience for me, because anyone who's been through any sort of trauma recovery of any kind knows that it can be very difficult, because you do need to talk a lot about what happened in order to metabolize it and to integrate it and to share it and to heal it. But a lot of times when you're looking for community in that experience, you can get sort of trapped in this middle layer of people who just want to regurgitate and repeat this same pattern in your consciousness again and again and again. And so you can have this push and pull experience with wanting to be in these communities, because you want to have the catharsis of speaking it and hearing others speak it and share it. But you can get lost in that sauce. And I feel like that's like a beautiful thing about getting to tell a story that's not just to the people who have been through what you've been through, because it actually makes you feel like you can reconnect to a greater picture of society, which for anyone who's been through any kind of trauma is really important, because you can feel so excluded and sort of sequestered to just one small corner of, you know, your niche that you're supposed to stay in forever because you've been through something that other people can't connect to. So that was really powerful for me as well, was witnessing in myself throughout the course of the event. I thought was really, really interesting too, because, you know, when people start with some of the stories that are like, they are deep and potent, but they're like much funnier. And, you know, it's like, it's just like, I'm a musician. So I have the experience of going to an event and someone's playing like a party song and everyone's having a great time. And you're like, well, I'm about to come out with my acoustic instrument and sing something very poetic and slow. But you have to trust, and this has happened to me before, you know, you have to trust that what you have will be authentic and true to you, and somehow life will line it up that that's the right moment for that. And it always works that way. If you ever try to tell the story that's not yours to tell, or you try to sing the song that's not in the style that's for you, it's worse and gets weirder. So I was so thankful that by the time my story came, I felt like, okay, this is the good story for me because it's my story to tell. But it was fun for me to witness as well that, oh, I should maybe not be telling like the most bizarre and personally intimate story right now.
But I wanted to ask you about this issue of discovering your toxic mold exposure. I mean, what a strange gift of the mushroom experience.
It was this very, very surreal experience to finally find out what had happened to me. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I was in this very strange first few months where I had no idea how to even talk to anyone about what had happened. But I did have a very scary seizure that had no explanation. That's one of the first times I had a CT scan, was because I seizured so hard that my body fell into the toilet and it shattered into 7 pieces.
You are kidding.
Like, we couldn't figure out how hard I must have been seizing that the porcelain toilet shattered.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I went that night. I had another small seizure that night in the hallway.
Very porcelain is very sharp.
There are so many things in this story that just seem to make no sense. It's like Final Destination, where it's like, how did you manage to make your way out of all of these near misses? But when I went to the hospital that night, my mom was with me. She sat in the ER with me the whole night. They did all the tests, everything, and there was just nothing. So then we started going a naturopathic route as an option, and they had some more answers, but still less helpful, still a bit inconclusive. And then ultimately I ended up, I don't even know how I met Dr. Marty, but Dr. Marty was this seemingly normal chiropractor who had a practice in the Valley in California, just seemed like a very normal left brain vanilla kind of guy. And I went in for a treatment. And I was describing all of the different ways that my body would lock up sometimes. And I was getting all these autoimmune tests because they thought I had lupus at one point. And he went into his office and he closed the door and he said, "Have you had any experiences with psychedelics?" And I said, yes. And he said, okay, have you been anywhere that there has been mold? And I said, I don't think so, because I didn't know at that point. And within that first week that I had met him, I went back the next week and my ex-boyfriend out of nowhere called me and said, I just wanted to let you know that we were just moving out of that house and they were ripping up all the walls and the ceiling and they found black toxic mold all over the ceilings. So he knew that I had the exposure, but then I took all the tests that show you what the crazy mold is doing in your body. And then I told him, and then he found out that he had also a toxic exposure. But again, totally different experience than me. So that's why it just feels like this ridiculous alignment, the sequence of events and the ways that things happened, you know, like meeting Dr. Marty, getting this information, having all of these very dangerous things happen, but somehow I was just like skating through these loopholes. That is what teed me up to be so ripe to receive Valerie, because otherwise I think I would have written it off so much more. But because there was this backlog of things that had happened, I was even more curious and open to it when she called with all of her inexplicable comments.
Absolutely. And when you describe her pulling something energetically from your body, this is something that we've heard stories about before, a true story, the similar experience, like a energy with a shape.
Yeah, that pulling of the energy is another part that I didn't have time to say in the story. But what was really fascinating was I had my suspicions that I knew that I had been molested. I did not know that I had been raped. I had my suspicions about it. I was walking on the beach one day in this very frenetic, sort of manic way, as I was many times during that period. And I felt, and I don't know if other people can relate to this experience, but I imagine that they can, where you feel this rising sensation of needing to say something out loud that you just don't want to say because it would just make it real to say it. And as I was walking on the beach, I said out loud, I was raped. And then I had this complete meltdown in like the fetal position on a very fancy beach in Malibu, which I'm sure was very interesting for all the couples walking their dogs on like a Sunday morning. And I think that what's fascinating is I did not tell Valerie that I had this experience. I told her that I knew that some spooky things were happening to me and that it was bringing up some stuff from my past. But when she was in the session with me, and I was laying on the table that I talk about, and she kept moving her hands over my body, she kept stopping at my womb space, like right where my womb and my pelvis is. And it's like she kept trying to finish the scan of the body, but she just kept getting stuck there. And my eyes were closed, but I could feel her doing more things. And, you know, and at some point when my body started to shake even more violently, I just started saying out loud, like, the rape, the rape, the rape. And that's when I felt like something pull out of me, and it felt like two swords just like pulled out of me. And I felt her sigh of like, okay, now we can actually move this, because my holding on to it and not wanting to acknowledge it and trying to keep it from her was preventing her from doing that. And that was yet another reason why I could not say that this was not real, you know, because it was something I was even willing to keep to myself, but that somehow energetically she knew and was able to move once I was able to also offer it up.
This is what you're talking about how our brain is protecting us, like for your life until the point when you could confront and start to heal from this trauma. Your brain was protecting you from that knowledge, it sounds like. But on some level it was really unhealthy for you, right? Like the repression of that horrible experience. And so it's showing up for you in these different ways.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, how are you feeling now?
I am so thankful that I get to be a person who has moved through the deepest traumas of my life. And I live a very gorgeous life. I love being alive. I absolutely would never take back any of the things that happened to me. And that's a very controversial and complex conversation to have, because I am obviously not condoning any sort of abuse of any kind to befall anyone. But for me personally, I know that I get to be who I am because of all of these experiences in my life. And at the same time, even if you have this expansive perspective of gratitude and the wholeness of things, and that can be your natural set point in how you live most of your life, you will also have days where you just feel like shit. And it's just very hard. And your nervous system can just feel overloaded or hurt. And just that smallest part of yourself just needs to feel whatever it needs to feel. So I would say that every once in a while, there are little days that are really deep lesson days where I feel many feelings that I would prefer not to feel. But every time that I do, and I go all the way through the thread of those feelings and really surrender into them without having to spiritually bypass them or talk them away or whatever it is, I get yet another layer of this wholeness that I get to live. So I feel like it's this lifelong dance that will always have more layers to it. But on a day-to-day level, I actually feel that because I've had to go so deep into dark and scary things in my life, I get to live a generally far lighter and more joyful existence than most because my fears are so close to my experience. I'm not holding myself away from the scariest things. I go towards them so willingly because I was first unwillingly pushed.
Right.
So now I go willingly. And that's a beautiful thing to have learned and get to live by.
It's also a beautiful thing for you to share with us. So the example is there and it's so complete in your story and in this explanation of your story. What a gift to everyone listening to think if we can move a bit more towards our fears and start to get some of that integration, that wholeness, that joy. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for giving us the background. And thank you so much for just being beautiful you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information about today's storyteller and conversation, check out the show notes. The True Story London podcast is hosted by me, Michelle Toth. Our producer is Ellis Ballard. Our theme music is by Sea Noise. Live recordings were provided by Laughing Around and recorded at 21 Soho. More information about our live shows and workshops can be found at truestorylondon.com. And just one more thing. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help us to reach more people. Thanks, and we'll see you for another episode soon.